Thank you for the introduction. Good morning and welcome to my talk. Today we're going to be talking about the Mac payloads from the now rather infamous 3CX supply chain attack. As mentioned, my name is Patrick. I am the founder of the Objective-C organization. We do all sorts of really neat stuff, all focused on Mac and Apple security. So I always like to start my talks with briefly mentioning what I hope you will learn today. So yes, we will be focusing predominantly on the technical details of the macOS payloads from the 3CX supply chain attack, but we'll also see how to triage Mac malware rapidly, which is very important, especially in the context of a supply chain attack where expediency is paramount. I'm sure many of you are very competent malware analysts, maybe even on the Mac platform, but a lot of us have focused predominantly on the Windows, so this is kind of a good case study for analyzing Mac malware as well. We're going to end the talk by talking about some heuristic approaches, behavior approaches to detect malware, which I think is important as well. So let's start with an overview. We have a definition of a supply chain attack. I'm sure we all know what that is, so I'll let you read that. But to me, what is interesting are some of these statistics from CrowdStrike, which were rather eye-opening to me and really showed that supply chain attacks are having a huge impact, and their sophistication and their prevalence is continuing to increase, which is worrisome because they are very impactful cybersecurity events. Now, the 3CX attack is very interesting for a few reasons. First, the 3CX is a company that creates VoIP application, PBX software, and has clients and customers around the world, Windows, Linux, and Mac, especially in the enterprise. Now, the way the attack unfurled is, as I mentioned, interesting because it was actually the first, perhaps, chain supply chain attack. And what I mean by that is, what happened was there was one supply chain attack where an APT group associated with North Korea infected a company called Trading Technology. Once they were in, they were able to infect this company's software, which then led to an unfortunate 3CX employee downloading this. So 3CX was actually a victim of the first supply chain attack. Now, obviously, when the 3CX employee downloaded and ran the infected Trading Technologies Windows application, this gave the North Korean adversaries access now to the 3CX enterprise network. They were then able to laterally move across the network to gain access ultimately to 3CX's macOS build machine. There they installed a piece of malware known as PoolRat. We don't have time to talk about that today. If you read the conference proceeding, I detail that. What we are going to be focusing on, though, are two components: the infection mechanism of the 3CX application, how the adversaries surreptitiously trojanized the 3CX application, and then the second stage payload that was downloaded on victims' computers. So how did the detections begin? This to me is rather interesting because what happened was users started posting on 3CX forums earlier this year saying our Windows EDR products are flagging unusual activity from your software. And I would recommend you have a read of these forums. They're still live because it's kind of a good case study of how not to respond to customers who say like, hey, what's going on? And not to pick too much on 3CX's support staff. They're probably not malware analysis experts. But they basically said, like, go ask the AV companies. We have no idea. It's probably a false positive. Retrospect, not the best response. About a week later, we got the first public report confirming that 3CX was indeed a victim of an ongoing supply chain attack. So CrowdStrike posted a great report. It was super Windows focused, but they did note that there was some Mac malware activity. Specifically, the quote on the slide says, hey, we saw some activity on Windows, yes, and they detailed that very well, but also on Mac and Windows, Linux. The problem was they didn't really provide any technical information, and other companies were saying, hey, we actually, we've looked at the 3CX macOS applications and installers, and we can't confirm at this time if anything is wrong. And if we put ourselves in the shoes of 3CX clients and customers, like, that's not ideal, right? Basically, the news is out that they suffered a supply chain attack, but nobody knows if the macOS installer and components are infected. So I decided to dive into the macOS payload and post some information that we are going to be talking about today. So now we've got the overview out of the way. Let's dive into some of the components of the 3CX supply chain attack, focusing on the macOS installer. So this is kind of the piece of the attack we're going to focus on. This is the application that 3CX developed for their Mac customers that, as we will see, was surreptitiously modified by the adversaries so that any user who downloaded and ran this application would unfortunately become infected. So I started by grabbing the 3CX macOS application. Again, at this time, we didn't know if this was infected or not. We knew 3CX had been compromised. CrowdStrike had confirmed that the Windows application had been infected. They pointed out that they had seen some macOS activity, but really didn't provide any technical details. So I thought, okay, it's possible that the Mac application is infected, but other companies with large security teams are like, we haven't found anything. If we look at the application, we see that it's signed and notarized, which is interesting. Notarization basically means that this application has been submitted to Apple. Apple has analyzed it or scanned it for malware and found none, and thus given it their stamp of approval. Okay, so Apple hasn't found anything. Other security companies haven't found anything. Maybe it's pristine. And one of the reasons maybe we didn't initially figure out that it was infected is because it's a very large application, over 400 megs. And I'm sure many of us here have gotten a binary to analyze that may or may not have been infected. And when it's like over 100 megs, you're just like, ugh, this is going to be a pain in the butt. Also, if we look at how many files are in this application, it's over 100. So we have a 400 meg application with over 100 files that may or may not be infected. So unfortunately, had our work cut out for us. Well, I eventually came across an interesting dynamic library called libffmpeg.dilib that at the time was not flagged by any of the engines on VirusTotal for having any malicious content. But if we look at it, we notice a few things. First, it's always going to be loaded every time the 3CX macOS application is run. And this is just because it's a dynamic library that has dependencies on other dynamic libraries which have dependence on the main application. So the main takeaway is every time the user runs the app, this dynamic library will be loaded. Not only will it be loaded, code within it will also be executed because it has a constructor in it. Normally, when you load a dynamic library, nothing is executed until you call into one of its exports. But you can add a constructor which will be automatically executed each time the dynamic library is loaded. Two interesting things. First, the ARM64 version has no constructor. So if you were actually looking at the ARM64 version, you wouldn't find anything malicious because it turned out that was pristine. So that was unusual. The other thing, though, is if we follow the constructor, we see it calls into a method that spawns off a background thread. Okay, that's kind of interesting. Let's dig into that. So that ultimately executes an unnamed subroutine that's over 600 lines of disassembled code. That's strange. That's not maybe that common in legitimate software. More notably, though, is this includes several things like XOR decryption loops. So at this point, I was like, okay, I think I'm on the right track. Right? We have this constructor that's always executed. It's spawning a background thread, executing a large subroutine that's also decoding or decrypting things. Like FFmpeg is not going to be doing this, right? So something is shady. If we continue on, we can write a very simple decryptor for this. Since it's XOR decrypting with a static key, it's trivial to write a Python script. And when we decrypt the embedded strings, we notice things like the address of a server and an embedded user agent. For all of you who've done malware analysis, command and control servers are often encrypted, so are agent strings. So again, red flags pointing out that this is almost certainly malware. So continued analysis did confirm that, in fact, this was malicious. So now let's talk about what the capabilities of this dynamic library were. So it did two basic things. First, it performed a simple survey of the infected machine. That's unsurprising. Think about supply chain attacks. They are going to indiscriminately infect a large number of victims. If you're a APT group or a nation state, you probably don't care about the majority of those victims, only some. And so to figure out which victims are of interest to you, you're going to want to perform a survey. So almost all first stage payloads of supply chain attacks perform some type of survey. So it performs a basic survey, gets information about the host, encrypts that, and submits that to the command and control server. The next thing it does is every time it's run, it will then download and execute a second stage binary that is called update agent. So here's code from the dynamic library, the disassembly. We can see very easily it just writes it out to a file within the 3CX desktop applications directory. It's always going to be called update agent. That's hard-coded. And once it's downloaded, it sets it to be executable and then kicks it off. So a very basic download and execute capability. So now let's talk about what this second stage payload does. Again, the piece of this is when a user has been infected via the supply chain attack, first stage implant or first stage dynamic library has beaconed out and downloaded and executed that. So again, basic triage. If we run the file command, we can see it's a compiled macOS executable. In terms of code signing information, not a lot of interest here because it's code signed with an ad hoc signature, which basically means it was locally signed. If we continue on, I often run the strings command to pull out any embedded strings. We can see that there are some interesting strings that, unlike the first stage dynamic library, which were all obfuscated, these are just in the plain. So that makes analysis a lot easier. And we can see things, for example, a path to what appears to be a configuration file, and then also information, perhaps a command and control server. Now, if we load this second stage payload into a disassembler, we can see that after it forks itself to daemonize, it self-deletes. Big red flag, unusual activity. We can observe this also in a file monitor. So on the bottom of the slide, I've run a file monitor, and we can see it's detected an unlink event. That's a delete file event. And the thing of interest is that the destination file and the path of the process responsible for the deletion are the same. So, I mean, this is the definition of self-deletion. We'll see when we talk about heuristic detections, this is a good thing to focus on because legitimate software rarely self-deletes. The other thing about self-deletion was this proved to be problematic for various security products because although they saw that their clients, their customers had executed this binary and in some cases even had a hash, since the binary was no longer on disk, they were not able to collect it. I was lucky enough, a copy fell off a truck, and so I was able to perform analysis of it. So if we continue analysis of this second stage payload, we can see that it has a method called parse JSON config. And what this is doing is it's extracting information from 3CX's legitimate config file. And the reason it's doing this is there's a lot of interesting information in that would be useful or of interest to the attacker. So for example, there's a lot of account information and also a randomized URL to the XML provisioning file for the 3CX installation on that company. So a lot of information in that. Again, with the file monitor, if we run the malware, we can passively observe it accessing this file and extracting those values. It then takes that information from the config file, encrypts that up, submits that to the command control server, and then does nothing, which was a little disappointing. We can see on the slide that after it's submitted to the command and control server, it checks if there was a response. If it gets the response, it just frees that memory and then calls exit. And since this was executed from the main function, when it returns, it's going to fully terminate. So I pondered on this a little while and talked to some other security researchers because I thought, okay, maybe it was going to do some tasking or persist itself. But no, it just exited. So kind of two main thoughts here why it really didn't do much. The first is that what likely is happening, and this is kind of hypothesizing, is that the adversaries obviously can provide unique copies of this update agent to every victim. So we mentioned that the first stage dynamic library is going to send some survey information to the attackers. Well, there's nothing stopping them from sending this maybe more vanilla, boring instance of update agent to the majority of victims. But the ones who are of interest, okay, maybe they will send the fully featured persistent backdoor. theory one. The other theory is perhaps we caught this early enough in the attack that the adversaries were still in the information gathering stage. Because as I mentioned, every time the user reruns the infected 3CX application, it's going to beacon out and re-download the update agent executable. So at any time, the adversaries could replace that with something more comprehensive, a fully featured persistent backdoor. So we're not sure exactly why, but end result is the current second stage payload doesn't do anything too crazy. But of course, at any time, it could be swapped out for something a lot more impactful. All right, so now let's talk about protection and detection. First, though, I want to talk about what doesn't work, because to me, this is equally important. Otherwise, we might focus on our efforts on maybe the wrong thing. So the fortunate reality is it's incredibly difficult to prevent supply chain attacks. I don't think you can as, a company. And the reason for that is, as CrowdStrike points out, modern software has so many dependencies, and these dependencies are controlled by other companies, right? Perhaps third-party libraries, third-party software. And if you're an enterprise worried about getting supply chain attacked, well, there's not too much you can do because you don't control the security of those other companies, which your software has dependencies on. So, not ideal. You might be thinking, okay, well, I'm going to stick to open source software. I will download and compile everything in-house, so these dependencies are a little more controlled. Well, if you're developing for macOS, good luck. Apple has made this incredibly difficult to do. So I release free open source software, but a lot of it has to have specific entitlements so it can run on recent versions of macOS. These are leveraged or required by Apple. How do you get these entitlements? You go to Cupertino, get on your knees, and beg. And after months, you might get it. The problem is, if you don't have these entitlements, even if you can compile the code, you won't be able to deploy it because macOS will check for those entitlements before it allows the software. So if you download my software and compile it, you're not going to be able to deploy it unless you have these entitlements, which are very difficult to detect. So that's kind of problematic. Also, the adversaries are pretty wily and sophisticated, and so what they're doing is now also infecting GitHub repos. So you have to be very careful about where you're getting your open source software from. And also, this might just not scale. So the open source route might not prevent supply chain attacks as well. You might also think, well, we can just, rely on Apple's security. And I am embarrassed to admit that I kind of thought this specifically in the context of notarization. So again, notarization means that when you compile a piece of software, before you deploy it, you have to send it to Apple, who scan it and give it their stamp of approval. Then and only then will it run on recent versions of macOS. So when I develop my tools, before I deploy them, I send them to Apple. Apple stamps them, notarizes that, and sends it out. And from a security point of view, I said, okay, this is great because in theory, in my naive mind, if anyone were to pull off a supply chain attack, imagine they've infected 3CX, well, they have to submit their trojanized installers to Apple before they can actually infect victims. So I was like, notarization should stop supply chain attacks in its tracks because Apple surely is going to see that this installer has now been maliciously subverted. Well, unfortunately, these things are a little more complicated, and notarization in this case failed to do what I would argue it was designed to do. And this is problematic because users trust notarized software more than normal software. So when Apple gives their stamp of approval to something that has been trojanized by the North Koreans, that's extra problematic. Okay, so what might work? Well, one thing is versioning or diffing. So Reversing Labs published an interesting blog post on this, and they compared the Windows version before and after the surreptitious modifications in this attack. And they found a lot of things that would have fairly easily revealed that something suspicious was going on. Now, of course, hindsight is 20/20, but I think this is something that perhaps we should look more into. So for example, if you diffed a clean version of the macOS installer versus one that had been impacted by the attack, you would see, for example, a new constructor had been added to a dynamic library. Okay, that is maybe not the strongest indicator of compromise, but that might be a reddish flag that says, okay, we should take a closer look into this. So diffing might be one way to detect supply chain attacks. But what I think is the best approach, as CrowdStrike agrees with, is one, acknowledging that supply chain attacks are very difficult to, detect, and prevent. But if we look for behavior-based heuristics, this might be the best way for us to detect that. So I'm going to end this talk focusing on some ideas for how we could have detected this attack in the first place and how we might be able to generically detect future supply chain attacks on macOS. So first, network detection. I'm a huge fan, especially in the context of these supply chain attacks. Imagine you had, for example, a DNS monitor running on your system. If a user downloaded and ran the infected 3CX macOS application, you would have seen some very unusual network queries. So the 3CX application should only be talking to 3CX infrastructure and perhaps some legitimate cloud-based servers. It should not, for example, be connecting to msstorageboxes.com. So huge red flag. And if you're doing network monitoring directly on the host, you can actually tie the DNS request back to the application that made it. So you could say, okay, 3CX's application is now talking to this command control server in some strange foreign country, like red flag. You also might be able to thwart supply chain attacks by blocking non-notarized software. So yes, unfortunately, the initial component of the attack was inadvertently notarized by Apple, but the second stage payload, which is the one that's normally more damaging and impactful, was not. So macOS tries to block some non-notarized software, but only in a limited subset. So it turns out, though, you can write a security tool which pretty easily will block all non-notarized software. So this is how you do it in a few lines of code. So what you can do is you can leverage the endpoint security framework. Basically, you can register for a process authorization event. And when you register for this, anytime a process is about to be spawned, macOS will invoke you and say, hey, are you cool with this process being executed? You can examine that process, and if you don't like it, you can return deny to the operating system, and macOS will prevent that process from being executed. So what we can do, for example, is when we get this process authorization request from the operating system, we can examine the binary and see what it's up to. For example, is it notarized or not? It's pretty easy to check if a binary is notarized with various code signing APIs. And in this case, if we determine that it is not notarized, we return the result deny constant back to the operating system, and it will prevent the binary from executing. So if you had a software like this running on your system, even though the initial payload would be executed, as soon as the second stage payload was downloaded and run, it would have been blocked and generated an alert. So this is just some example code. I've implemented this in one of my tools, block. So if you want to see how to fully implement that, you can pop over to the GitHub repo and check that out. Now, of course, there's other anomalous behaviors that perhaps we could key on to detect malware or other components of a supply chain attack. That could be a whole talk unto itself. But one easy one, as I mentioned, is self-deletion. Most legitimate software does not self-delete. Sure, some does, but a lot of malware will implement self-deletion capabilities. And as we mentioned, the reason malware does this is it's a great stealth technique and also makes it perhaps difficult for security products to then gain access to the binary. If it's been deleted from disk, there's nothing to collect. So that's good from the malware's point of view, from a stealth point of view, but that's a huge red flag. Like, if you see a binary that's self-deleting, like, take a closer look. It might not be malware, but it's something that you might want to dig into. As I mentioned, it's pretty easy to detect self-deletion. If you're monitoring file events and you see a deletion where the item that's being deleted is itself, that means self-deletion. So again, in that case, take a closer look. Okay, let's begin to wrap this all up. So the main takeaway is really that the unfortunate reality is supply chain attacks are becoming more prevalent, more complex, and their impact is increasing. Previously, supply chain attacks pretty much only went after Windows systems, especially in the context of the enterprise. And that was simply Macs in the enterprise were not that common, not that prolific. But as we know, that's changing. Macs in the enterprise are becoming super common. And there's even a lot of predictions that eventually Mac and Windows will have parity on the enterprise, which I think will eventually get there. Hackers are obviously very opportunistic. So as the number of Macs increase, hackers spend more time hacking Macs. And so especially when they, for example, infect a company like 3CX that has software for Windows and Macs, they are going to also impact the macOS payload. So what we need to do is not panic and freak out, but we need to study the components of known attacks to gain insight into how the adversaries are going to be targeting, for example, Mac computers in the enterprise, and then build heuristic-based products to hopefully detect future supply chain attacks. Now, if you're interested in learning more, I've written a book on this topic. It's 100% free online, so this is not a sales pitch. You can also buy a hard copy as well. All profits and royalties go back to the Objective-C Foundation. I'm also working on a second book, kind of part 2 in the series, that dives into how to programmatically detect macOS malware in the first place. So kind of some of the topics we touched on will be focused in that book, which again also will be made available online as well for free. And speaking of the foundation, I just wanted to give a shout out to the foundation because it's awesome. We do all sorts of really neat things. We organize the Objective by the Sea conference, which is next week. I know many of you will be there. It's an Apple-focused cybersecurity conference. We also do scholarships and some neat diversity programs. So if you're a company that wants to support some great community efforts, definitely check us out. And speaking of giving thanks, I just wanted to end by thanking the companies that support the Objective-C Foundation. They're the ones that allow me to do this kind of research, release the free open source tools, and organize the conference. So a lot of appreciation and thanks to them. I think I have a few minutes for questions. So if there's any questions about this, I would love to answer those.